people. This is a little tutorial on this lovely West Highland Terrier named Poppy here. I'm just going to draw a little bit of her white fur, just basically showing you basic technique of what I would use to do this type of fur. So I'm only going to be using some warm greys, a few cold greys, some light purples and some light blues to tone and create the fur texture in this piece. You can see I've already started a little bit and I've added all the purples that you can see that I will be using there. So I start off just by adding in some mid-tone layers. So I'm using some warm grey 4 just to add all of the hair details on her nose there where it's really dark, and I'm adding these just so I can map them out and keep them there so I don't lose them with subsequent layers. And I'm just toning those mid-tones down with some purples. You see some Pablo mauve there and some light violet from the Polychromos. Then going back over again with some warm grey 4 just to darken it all up. All of these purples that I'm adding help to add depth and tone to the piece here. I'm adding in some really dark hairs with a sepia pencil from the Pablo range. Adding in the hairs in this manner will just help me to keep the structure of her face. I usually work from light layers to dark layers, but with this piece I changed it up a little bit and I used some mid-tones. Then I went with the lighter layers. You can see there I added some warm grey 1. Then I go back to using my darker colours. So I'm adding warm grey 1 all over as a base layer, and then I'm adding in some fur details with some cold grey 3. The basis of this portrait is just minimal layers, just didn't use as many layers as I would usually. That's because I wanted to keep this piece really nice and clean. I didn't want to muddy all of the layers by adding heavy layers of colour and lots of layers of colour, which wasn't really necessary for this kind of portrait and this kind of dog. All I do when I'm creating my fur lines is use a transitional pencil strokes. So I start off where I first place my pencil at the base of the hair. I use quite a hard pressure, and then as I go towards the end of the hair I lift off and use minimal pressure. So it's like a tapered line, like you would find with blades of grass. They're thicker at the bottom, and then as you come towards the tip of the grass it's a lot thinner, and that's basically the same sort of principle that I use when I'm drawing fur like this. The other technique I use is just ordinary shading or hatching, and I just do this all over in one direction, usually the direction that the fur is going, unless it's like a blurred image, in which case it doesn't really matter. I always make sure that I erase my graphite lines and then go back over with a coloured pencil, and that's so that graphite doesn't show through on subsequent layers, because sometimes that happens, especially on these light coloured dogs. I don't really want a harsh graphite line showing through, I just want all of that lovely coloured pencil showing. I'm using warm grey 2 and warm grey 3 to add some shading details to all of the fur here. Basically just shading underneath where the fur is laying over one another. So I've got a really bright fur line, and then underneath you've got all that shading, which is where I'm adding the warm greys and all of those violets, and I will add a few blues as well, you'll see there. But you can see how just shading all of these colours on top of one another adds a little bit of depth to this piece. So again, I add in all of my fur lines. I always make sure that I reference back to my reference photo, always checking that I've got the fur lines going in the right direction. If I've got one going in the wrong direction, sometimes it makes it look a little bit obscure, it doesn't quite look right, so I always make sure I double check with my reference photo, make sure everything's going exactly the right way. I don't always follow the reference photo 100% because I find that it makes it look a bit too contrived and it makes it look a bit false. So I improvise a little bit with some of the layers of fur just to make it look a little bit more natural. All of these pencils going down now, adding to the shadows underneath all of that fur. You can tell I'm not really using as many layers because you can see the shade of the paper shining through most of this. On the really light bits where the eyebrows overhang into the eyes, there's a lot of the paper showing through there, and I've just added lines of a few colours, just shaded, cross-hatched a few, but mainly it's the shade of the paper, and I just want to keep all of this portrait really minimal, don't want to muddy it at all. I also add a little bit of white over the top here and there. That's just to bring out those really, really white lines. Sometimes I erase a little bit of the fur, which I've done as well, just to help keep that brightness in there. But using a white pencil does exactly the same, just helps to brighten that patch of fur. So on the top of her head here, I'm just adding in some fur lines. I always add the directional fur lines, the dark ones first when I'm doing this kind of portrait. Shade in all the dark areas, all the shadow areas where the fur's overlapping one another. And then toning it all down with blues and purples. You always find in a white dog all of the reflected backgrounds. So if your dog is sitting in a load of grass, you will find that there's lots of greens reflected in white fur, and similarly if it's in a red room, say, you'd find lots of pinks, lots of oranges and reds reflected in the fur. So you really need to make sure that you look at your background when you're doing white dogs like this. So we're coming to the end now, and that's basically it for this short tutorial, guys. Bye!